It's nice to see lots of people here. My name is Peter Albrechtsen. I'm a sound designer from the other side of the water, Copenhagen. I've done sound design for 2 documentaries playing here at the festival. Distant Barking of Dogs, which some of you may have just seen and heard, and False Confessions, which is playing later today. When I got asked to do this talk, I was really happy because I think it's so great that there's more and more focus and interest in sound for documentaries. I think something that's really been elevating documentaries during the last 15, 20 years is an interest in film language, and it's becoming more and more evident that there's a lot of directors who are, of course, very much into the story, into the characters, but also very much into visuals, into sound, into music, into picture editing, and making movies, and not only making journalistic stories. And I think there's a vast difference there that's very interesting. And I think that evolution of how to make documentaries and what is possible in documentaries is really fascinating. For me, some of the most amazing sound design that's been done in the film world during the last 15 years is in documentaries and films like Tarnation and Leviathan and Sept, movies which all really like explore what stories you can tell through the years, and they are very little based on words and logic, but a lot based on moods and atmosphere and creating a special environment that you kind of step into when you experience the film. For me, when making movies, of course it's about storytelling, it's about bringing stories to life, but it's also about creating a universe almost, an environment that the audience can inhabit and be part of, and feel drawn into a story, instead of just sitting on the outside and looking in. I feel that there's a vast difference between the kind of old school way of doing documentaries, which were very kind of doing interviews like with a lot of faces and some intercut images here and there, and then the way that a lot of documentaries are done now, which are much more like vibrant and unpredictable. And not that journalistic documentaries can't have a lot of qualities as well, but I really think the development is really interesting, and I feel that it's something that has made documentaries such an amazing thing to follow during the last years. There's so much more interest now, and I mean, coming from Copenhagen, experiencing Copenhagen docs and how that is just growing every year. There's so much interest in going to the cinema and experiencing documentaries. 40 years ago, that would have been unheard of. So for me, my angle on documentaries is really making the movies come alive through the years. And how do you do that? What is when I say something like that, it's kind of like, what does it mean? It's a little abstract. The thing about talking about sound is that it is very abstract, actually. And therefore it can be very hard to talk about. And it's actually interesting because on the other side, sound is something that is very, very basic to us. The first sense we get inside our mother's belly, uterus, is the sense of hearing. So we are able to hear while we're inside the belly. So this is why when a child is born, then it can be calmed through the voice of the mother, because it has already learned to hear that sound. Apparently the uterus is supposed to be a very noisy place on top of that, but let's not talk too much about that. That's but saying that hearing is the first sense we get, and then when we're born, then we start seeing. And what does this mean? This means that hearing is something that really touches something very primal, very basic, very subconscious in us. It's very much a connection to the emotions. Back in the 1970s, the term sound designer was invented by an American sound designer, Walter Murch, who was also a brilliant picture editor. And he said that the image goes through the front door and the sound seeps through the back door. And I think that's a really relevant way of describing it, because we're very conscious of what we see. We're often not very conscious of what we hear. But it has an enormous impact on us anyway. Today I'm going to focus on the distant barking of dogs. And I brought some clips from the film that has some different sound layers, so we can kind of hear what is it about this thing about creating a sonic world that this guy up here is talking about. Because sometimes, explaining it all is a little hard. There's this thing about our language even, that when we talk about visuals, we have a lot of words about colors, about shades, about all these different visual nuances. And when we talk about sound, it's often like, okay, this sound should be a little more like, or maybe, I mean, very quickly it's kind of like a meeting in the kindergarten. So when you talk about sound, you often need to kind of have examples and talk about some more precise examples of what is it you mean when you say we need this sound to be more blue. So for me, as a sound person, it's very important to be part of the process of doing the documentary very early on. So usually nowadays I'm really privileged to be part of the process, usually already when the shooting is going on, or at least when the picture editing starts up. Because this means that I very early on knows or get inspired to know about this world that the film is portraying. Usually when you do images, you have all these, I mean, you can do storyboards or mood boards, or this should look a little bit like this, and this should look a little bit like this, and I'm always thinking, like, why don't we do like a Sonic Storyboard? And what do I mean by that? I mean that for me, creating the sonic environment of the film is super important. But it's not something you just do like that. It's something that takes a lot of time and a lot of research. And my working method usually, also in this film, is that, for example, on Distant Barking Your Dogs, it's a movie that takes place in Ukraine, at the border between Ukraine and Russia, in the war zone. And I knew that we needed a lot of local ambiences, a lot of local sounds, recordings of the environment and animals and so on. Because something that Simon, the director, told me from the very beginning, I did the sound together with two Finnish sound designers who I've worked with for many years now, Heikki Korsi and Pietro Kornen. And the three of us had these early meetings with Simon where he said that an interesting thing of being in this environment was that people are moving away, at least the people who have the money to do so, but the animals are still there. So there's still cows, there's still sheep, there's still some birds, there's still insects, there's still all these different, dogs, of course, which are even a part of the title. So that was a very fundamental sound in this environment, that you don't hear people, you don't hear machinery, but you hear the animals. I started doing some research, and we got hold of a recordist from the area, a sound recordist, who was able to record a lot of ambiences for us, a lot of sounds from the area of all these different animals. Because Simon, when he was shooting the film, was like a one-man army. He had a translator there, but it was really like him with the camera, a microphone on the camera, and a radio mic that he could put on some people, sometimes two radio mics when it got really advanced. But apart from that, he didn't really bring big sound equipment to record things. Not that sound equipment needs to be big. One of the great things about sound equipment nowadays is that you can have these small handy recorders and record really great sounds with those. But he was really focused on, of course he was, very focused on being intimate, being close to these two boys who are the main characters in the film, and following them, being with them, describing their environment, being part of their environment, and shooting all the time. So he didn't have the time to kind of go out and spend a lot of time on recording all these background sounds. So for me it's really important that the birds you hear, the animals you hear, the sounds of the environment are the right environment. So it was really amazing to get hold of a local sound recordist who could record these sounds. So I got this library of animal life from different seasons, because Simon went to the place for different seasons, and because he contacted us very early about the sound, then we knew, okay, he's gonna be there in the spring, in the summer, in the autumn, in the winter. So we need someone to go out now and then and record. And that's not something that's very expensive to ask someone to do. It just needs some planning, and it just needs to be a part of how you schedule things, so that you have the sound person as part of the process very early. So we have the time to collect these sounds. And then of course a big thing is also all these sounds of war, which you hear in the film. The first clip I want to show from the film is one of these war scenes. And I brought the clip in different layers so we can hear how it's built up. I think I'm just going to show that, and then I can talk about the process about that. if you suddenly have questions or something, then please feel free to. How many saw the film? Almost all of you. That's great. Thank you. So this is a scene where they're sitting at this bonfire, and it's in this area where they start hearing bombings and so on. So it's a sequence with lots of war sounds.
Вот у меня появился костер.
Гаубица.
А что это было?
Гаубица.
Убийца.
Знаешь, что такое гаубица? Гаубица — это установка. А подожди, не надо. Не, направляешь снаряд. И делается выстрел.
Костя, а ты ходишь в подвал, когда стреляют?
Раньше ходил, сейчас нет.
Я тоже.
Когда серьезно начнут стрелять, когда ответка сильная полетит, свисты разрывы, тогда да.
Ну, это уже, да. А вот, ну, тогда, когда так вот это вот сейчас как, тогда нет. Ну, да.
Решение подваживать.
Ты далеко? Не боишься? И стрелял.
Да, фонарик. Хорошо, не нахуй.
Да. Мы можем дома развести у нас костер. Будем спокойно сидеть, не бояться, можем быстро в подвал. У нас там подвал делать. Так. Так оно там такое горит, там под речкой. Там горит.
Ой,
Я знал, что ты волнуешься.
гори, гори. А дальше что?
Ты боишься?
Нахуй.
Чего?
Или там падает. Да.
Чтоб у нас было.
Да, там все вот так пошли, не выйдем, просто глянь на поворот. Вот это. Да я не стреляю. Я нашел туда, стреляю туда. Мне кажется, туда.
A quiet little scene. Nothing much happens. This is very, very intense, of course, and when working on a film like this, it's also a very emotional experience because you're so involved with these characters, and you really want to make sure that the film is honest to them, so that you feel like this is a description of how they feel during these moments. What is it they are going through? How is it like to be in an area like this? What happens to you as a human being when you're under such a pressure? The thing is that if you just put up a microphone and have it turned towards a kid sitting at the fireplace in a scene like this, then you're not really getting the environment of him. You're getting the sound of what he's doing while he's sitting at the fire, but you don't get everything that's around him. And the thing is that no one has invented the microphone with a brain yet. We're still waiting for that. It's gonna take a while, I guess. The microphone is not recording what is actually there. It's recording what you're pointed at, and there's a big difference. So I brought the sound of this sequence so that we could hear just how it sounds from the recording. Just a second. Okay, so this is the sound that was recorded.
Вот у меня появился костер.
Гаубица.
А что это было?
Гаубица.
Убийца.
Знаешь, что такое гаубица? Гаубица — это такая установка. А подожди, не надо. Не, выправляешь снаряд. И делаешь быстро.
Костя, а ты ходишь в подвал, когда стреляют?
Раньше ходил, сейчас нет.
Ну, я тоже.
Когда серьезно начнут стрелять, когда ответка сильная полетит, свист и разрывы, тогда да.
Ну, это уже, да. А вот, ну, тогда, когда так вот это вот сейчас как, тогда нет. Да.
Надо сильно подваживать. Сейчас я приду.
Ты далеко? Не боишься? И стреляют. Костя!
Да, фонарик. Хорошо, не нахуй.
Да. Мы можем дома развести у нас костер. Будем спокойно сидеть, не бояться, можем быстро в подвал. У нас там подвал рядом.
Так что, туши не будем давать?
Да,
Я бы тебя.
Так. Так оно там такое горит, там понад речкой.
Ты шо?
Так горит.
Ой.
Я знал, что ты волнуешься.
Там горит, горит. А дальше, блин.
Ты боишься?
Я боюсь.
Чего?
Или там падает.
Ты что, чтоб у нас было?
Был беспилотник только что. Да, там все вот так пошли, выйдут просто глянь на поворот.
Вот.
Дальше стрелит. Вот это. Ладно. Да я не стреляю. Это же оттуда стреляет туда.
Да.
Мне кажется, туда идти. Куда? Назад.
It's a very different film. The thing is that one of the things that for me is really always opening up the storytelling of the sound world inside a film is that you have a character that's listening. So Oleg here is really listening. He's listening a lot. Because this environment that he's part of is all about hearing these things and constantly figuring out where are things happening and what soldiers are doing what, where, and how close is the bombing and how distant is it, how dangerous is it to be in this environment. And it's something that he's evidently doing here in this sequence. He does it throughout the film. He's really listening. So when you have a character like that, it opens up for sound, because when we see someone listening, then we start to listen ourselves. It's kind of like this basic reaction that we have, like, what is he hearing? What is he hearing? I want to hear that as well. So in this sequence, I think there's like 6 distant bombs. You hear a little bit, not much more than that. And when going through the film with Simon, the director, he was like, this is not how it is. This is not how it is to be there. This is not the experience of being in this place. I want to feel the physical impact of the sound that's happening in this place. Because that's saying so much about how he reacts, about his emotions, about the character, and about the environment. So Simon was really like, these sounds of war are very important, and I know exactly how they sound, because he was there for a year recording this film, shooting this film. So he's been part of that environment for a long time. As a sound designer, you always get a little scared when a director is saying, I know exactly how this sounds. Because then the next step is like, this should sound like the flagpole in my neighbor's garden when I was 7 years old. I remember that sound evidently. And you're sitting there as a sound designer thinking, okay, I'll try to figure this out. But for Simon and for this film, then, I mean, the very natural way of doing this was to say, okay, they are even talking about what weapons this is. I mean, which weapons are firing. And we knew exactly which weapons they were using in this area. So Heikki and Peter in Finland got hold of a guy up there to help them record these exact weapons at a big military place in Finland. I was not going to tell Simon to go out there and record these weapons for us. That was meant to be a joke. So they went out there in much more controlled circumstances and recorded all these different weapons and in different distances and so on. So we had all these bullets and so on, all these very specific weapons that they use in this area. And then Simon, who knew, he knew how does it sound when a weapon from the Russians are fired, and how does it sound if it comes close to you? How does it sound if it explodes in the distance? How does it sound if Ukrainian soldiers, when they fire their grenades, how does it sound in the distance? How does it sound when it gets close? So for a scene like this, we drew a map of all the different explosions in the scene, this whole sequence, making a list of, okay, this bomb at this time code is fired from the Russian side, and it has to take this time to land close to them. In the beginning of the scene, it's a little more distant, so it takes a longer time from the firing of the grenade to the explosion of the grenade. The further we get into the scene, that distance between the sounds become smaller, which means they get closer. The delay of every explosion got smaller, which means that the explosions get closer. It sounds very nerdy when I talk about it like this, a little like repairing a car, but it was actually such a great way of creating a sonic dramaturgy for these things and making sure that you do it in a way where you're very authentic, actually, to what happens. When I talked about this way of working with the sound earlier with some other colleagues, they were like, "Oh, could you do that? I mean, is that authentic?" And I'm always like, well, this is very authentic. This is emotional authenticity, which is something that I find very important. I think in documentaries, actual authenticity doesn't really exist. I mean, as soon as you decide on a certain story, as soon as you decide on pointing your camera at a special part of the world, as soon as you do your first picture edit, it's no longer authentic. Because neutral authenticity doesn't exist. But emotional authenticity exists. And it's super, super important. And in this film, it was so important. And playing the film for the kids at the premiere, they were like, this is how it feels, was really important. So we structured these sounds of war like that. So yes, we were using explosions. Yes, we were using sound design of sound of wars. But at the same time, everything was thought out and planned and very much kind of following also the dramatic curve of the sequence. So you have these moments of very quiet. You hear just the sound of this bonfire. And then comes these explosions. And then it becomes louder and louder. And that kind of dynamic, I feel, is always really interesting to utilize when you work with sound. So one thing is like you have a dramaturgy for the story that you're telling. I really feel that if you're also thinking about the dramaturgy of the sound in the film, then you get this. Then you can build up a dynamic and a visceral intensity and a poetic quietness that's really amazing. If you go through the film and then you think about, okay, what is the sound level of each scene? Okay, this scene is quiet. Then comes a very loud scene. Then this scene is also quite loud. Oh my God, this is also loud. And this is loud. Okay, and then comes something quiet. Then maybe you should consider like having one of those 4 very loud scenes being more quiet to get this dynamic, to not like bombard the audience. If everything is super quiet all the time, sometimes it gets also undynamic. Silence is amazing and very poetic and beautiful, but it also is enhanced by dynamics. And the way that Simon shot this story and really thinking about the sounds were really like important to be able to create the dynamics in the film. So you have moments of like quietness and intimacy, and then you have moments like this, that's very dramatic and intense and quite violent. There's one thing missing from this clip. You got something? Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting in the film that when you're talking about the dramaturgy of the sound, that in the opening shots, you announce the sound very distinctly for us by having the explosions when we're driving in the car and that point of view where the sound is very visceral, which kind of, I think, leads us into the sound design. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that decision, and then also perhaps talk a little bit, Peter, about how you communicate on with the director, because you talked about that, but you didn't really kind of say, how did you get beyond kindergarten to talk about what you were doing, so that it would be helpful for those of us who need to work with sound designers. How do you talk to that person? Yeah.
That's 2 great questions. The first thing about the opening and the setup of the film, in a way. You have this shot from inside a car, and you see one of these grenade attacks, and it starts out like quietly, you're driving in this car, and then comes this very, very intense, violent grenade attack. And yes, that was very much a way of setting up how we will work with the sound in this film. For Simon, also a way of saying we build up something that feels almost like a normal everyday life. You drive in the car, and it was important that the car didn't sound like a special car. It had to sound very neutral, ordinary car. You're just sitting there, and then comes these explosions, and it's very intense and very, very visceral, very, very loud. And that dynamic between the everyday life and the violent nature of the sounds of war goes throughout the film. And it also meant that Simon, then we went into this opening of the film where we present the characters, and it's actually really quiet. But you start listening because your senses get alert, which is something that I find very important in, like, when you establish a film, like really think about, okay, how do we make the audience emotionally involved in this? And I feel that something that really makes them very involved is this feeling of unpredictability, and at the same time that you should use your senses and not just hear people talk, but it's also about like being in an environment and registering what's going on. So when you've had that opening, then suddenly you hear the rest of the film differently. And it was interesting when we were working on the film, because then, I mean, then you start working on all these scenes, and I remember, like, okay, there's those first 3 or 4 scenes, they're quite quiet, like after the explosion. All these small things, and small creaks, and steps on dirty road, and dogs barking in the distance. Some creaks of things. And all these things, you're so aware of them because you've just been through that explosion. So it really changes your perception of what you're experiencing. Talking about the actual, I mean, the actual collaboration, how do we talk? Simon is not a director who's really very good at talking about sound. And I think it's important to realize that that's totally okay. I've met directors who were like, oh, I don't know, I can't work, I can't do sound like that because I can't talk about sound. Or I don't know how to talk about this. I don't know how to talk about that. I don't know how to talk about sound. I can talk about sound now, but I mean, if we really get into the nitty-gritty of everything, how do I explain a certain sound for someone? It's really, really hard. And what you have to do is then start doing some work where you can listen to, give examples of what is it you want to achieve with the sound. So that's usually what, I've done 2 short films with Simon before this film. So on this film it was like, okay, it started out just, what I actually usually do is picking out 2 or 3 kind of key scenes in the film, and then I do sound design for them. And then we listen to that together, because that's a way of kind of just starting to find out the vocabulary of the sound of the film and the vocabulary of our collaboration in a way. And I often do that during the picture editing. So it's very scratchy, even, I mean, the edit of the scene, it's not finished, but it's just a way of slowly kind of finding out, okay, how should this sound? For the first pass of those things, then Simon came in, and I really remember that we were sitting there listening, and he was like, we've been, I mean, working on like very small details, and like, okay, a little creak there, and a little sound there, no, we have to be very kind of calm with these boys and so on. And he was like, well, it sounds nice, but it's too little. I want this whole world to creak. I want everything that you see should be creaking. Everything should be like, when you sit down on a chair, it's like, when you open a door, it's like, when you walk on the floor. Everything in this world should be creaking, should be falling apart. And he really wanted to have that in the sound. And that's an amazing way of saying to you, okay, this is a strategy of how to develop the sonic language for this film. So suddenly, like, we could start like building up things like that, and then at the same time, he talked about these war sequences, how the impact of those were very important, and that they should have this physical feeling to them. And with just those kind of guidelines, then suddenly you're much further in your collaboration. Suddenly, okay, so this is how we should approach things. So what we then did was that then they moved on with the picture editing. Actually, this scene that I just showed you was one of the first kind of sequences we did while they were picture editing, because they couldn't really edit the sequence without having sounds there. You needed the sounds to be able to find the timing. And that's the thing that also happens with when you really integrate sound into the storytelling, is that sound changes rhythm and it changes the feel of your scenes. So quite often when you start adding sounds, it feels like everything is going a bit faster. And often in the picture editing, just one second. Often in the picture editing, what you do is you get more and more precise about like developing your story. So everything gets more and more compact and precise. And usually that means taking out the air, or it can mean that you kind of take out the places where the story is not kind of physically or logically kind of developing. And that's also why I feel it's so important to be there very early, because I go in and see the rough cuts as they develop, and I can say, okay, I think that sequence there, we can do something really great with the sound. So don't cut down that part. Let's try and do some sounds to see how does that influence the timing of everything? How does that influence the feel and the rhythm? And usually what happens is that we end up making things longer, because when you use sound, then you change the whole feel and the rhythm.
Yeah, my question is exactly related to that basically this kind of film, that actually the sound wall is having a dialogue with the characters, so how much you have to bounce forward and back from the sound edit to the picture edit, because that's like almost a character to me, the whole.
Yeah, so we really needed to do this kind of, we did some, I think 3 of these scenes where we did like sound sketches, and then what I then usually do is also like, then we have like, okay, a bomb in the distance sounds like this, and then I give a little library for the picture editor, because then the picture editor can start putting some of these sounds in. So it's not like, Peter, we can't pick up the film now because we need some sound. But when we've been through a couple of sequences and found out, okay, what kinds of sounds are we looking for, then I can give these sounds to the picture editor, and he or she can use them in the rest of the film. And it really, really helps the process. Also because what often happens in the picture editing, if you want to have a scene where there's more air and not so much talk and more based on atmospherics, then usually you put in a piece of music. Because then it's kind of like, okay, we're there. In the picture editing, sometimes there's a little bit like doing commercial radio, that with, silence, what is that? No, don't go there, it's dangerous. Stay away from the silence. No, there's this fear almost of things dying out and being too quiet and being dead in a way. So that if you add a piece of music, then suddenly like this atmospheric piece, music is great, music is wonderful. There's also music in this film, which I'll talk about in a minute. But sometimes it also takes away the presence of the reality. Music is an amazing way of creating mood and atmosphere, but it's also there's no music playing right now. There's no music playing in our reality. So music is kind of like a parallel dimension to the film, which is amazing to inhabit now and then, but it can also somehow take away from the grittiness and the reality of something. And especially in a moment where you would like to have a more reflective, poetic moment, music can be amazing, but sometimes it's also magical to just have the quietness there. And then if you have some ambient sounds from the sound editor, which can be used in the picture editing, so that it's not just like a recording of a bird from YouTube or like another sound library from Hollywood Edge or something like that. If you have the actual sounds that the sound editor is going to use, so you share libraries very early on. I give like a little library to the picture editor so that the picture editor has some sounds to work with. And that opens up for these things where you can have poetic reflective moments that's not just about music, but also about the presence of being there without words. Francis Ford Coppola, who I think is one of the maestros of sonic movie making, Apocalypse Now and The Conversation and Rumblefish, The Godfather. He said at one point, remember that all the most magical moments in life happened without words. That might not be true, but it's still worth reflecting about. I just want to talk a little bit about music. The collaboration with music and how to get sound and music kind of integrated into each other. I feel sometimes like music can be a wonderful thing, but it kind of lies a little bit on top of the film. And I feel that if the composer is involved just as early as me as a sound designer, very early in the process, and the picture editor actually have some sketches of music available during the picture editing, then it's really the key to integrating the music into the film. What I found recently was actually going even further than that has been really interesting. And what I mean by that is that when I get the music from the composer for the first time, usually I just get one track, like one cue, with everything put together, and you put it on and you think, okay, this is good, or you think, no, there's some issue here. But what I often then nowadays ask the composer is to split it out, so it's in stems, what we call stems, which means that you split out the different instruments so that you have the violin, and the piano, and the background strings and the drums, but however it is, I mean, like getting a few different layers, because it suddenly means that you have much more variety of how things can sound. And I feel often that a mistake that often happens from the composer's side is that when you're a composer, you write a piece of music and you're thinking, okay, this is an amazing piece of music. And it might be when you hear it on its own. But then you take the amazing piece of music and put it into the film, and it's kind of just filling out everything. There's no room left to breathe. There's no room left to reflect. There's no room left for the characters. And I feel that sometimes getting the music in parts can really open up the process, and suddenly, wow, okay, we use the organ here and only the string, and that simplicity is very powerful in itself. And we tried that in a lot of places here, like we don't need all these instruments, we can actually just use that part of it, and then you talk with the composer and he's like, yeah, that's, wow, let me try and develop that, and then just use the violin for this, and then those textures are great, let's work with those. It's a way of opening up the communication between sound, music, director, and picture editing. So you're not locked into like, it has to sound exactly that way. No, it's, when you get the music, suddenly there's also options there. Just like when you get the visual material, there's different options. When you get the sound effects, there's different options. On this film, we had this old organ, which is a key kind of instrument coming back throughout the film. And then there were like there's kind of like a second kind of musical vocabulary, which is more like based on strings and ambient textures, which comes in during, especially during some of these voiceovers with the grandmother. And especially for some of those sequences, I really wanted the sound and the music to be tied very much together. So I then got the elements from the Swedish composer Uno Helmersen, who gave me like the textures of his track and the strings of his track, and then I could make, for example, there was some of these flashbacks where I'm using like distant sounds of war, and then I could tune those in the same note, in the same key as the music. So they are playing the same kind of notes, so it's almost like all of it turns into music. And it's a way of making sound and music come together.
Peter, could you play, because I don't recall the music at all in the film. Yeah, and it would be really nice to just hear the music by itself and to hear it in a scene if you have that.
Yeah, I brought one of these voiceover
It
sequences.
completely disappeared for me.
Yeah, but that's a good sign. Hopefully the sound did as well.
Well, no, the sound didn't disappear from me, but
Okay.
because I thought the sound was very much present.
Звук был ужасный, по крыше тарахтел, потому что задрожал весь дом. Через 2 дома снаряд упал к соседу. Снаряд упал во дворе, а осколок попал в дом, и он сидел в этот момент за столом, и ему отрубало полголовы, такой. И был мертвый. Жена вышла в шоке, разговаривать не умеет. Перечерняла от страху.
So this is one of these sequences where sound and music's really like integrated into each other, and the tonalities of the sounds play around with the tonalities of the music. And at the same time, it was important for all the music to be very kind of handheld in a way, like it feels very organic, just like the sound should be. The thing that happens when everything is creaking and is that everything feels like very physical and textured, and it feels alive in a way. And that thing was really important in this film, getting the emotional authenticity right. I think time is running out, but maybe if someone has some final question, then
What would be your biggest advice or most important advice to a filmmaker that want to start working seriously with sound as a real device of storytelling?
I think it's really important to think about the environments that you portray, that not just think about the visuals that you're gonna portray, but also that it's a sonic environment. And use your ears when you're shooting. A thing that always kind of like, or has often happened, is that you have the photographer and maybe the director is shooting these amazing, beautiful panoramas of like also in this city, also in this film, like these beautiful fields or beautiful cityscapes or whatever. And then they put up the camera and then they call on the phone and stand next to the hello, no, I'm not coming back right now, no, I don't. And then the camera is shooting these images. And I'm like, okay, couldn't you just have been quiet and then put on a microphone on the camera and record that sound? Because suddenly you would have had like a library of these beautiful sounds that you record all the time. So for me, that part of it is really important, like to get directors to think about, okay, what is happening through the years. And I'm usually, I have several of these small handheld recorders, which are really like highly recommended because they sound really good and they don't cost that much. It's like 2,000 or 3,000 kroner for something that has a quality that can go directly into the film. And I record sounds all the time. I always go around with these. I mean, when I go to the supermarket and I hear a weird fridge, I'm like standing there recording the sound. And my 2 kids are like running away. They're used to like trying to seem like they don't know me at all. But I usually borrow one of those to the director and say, okay, please just record something when you're there. And usually then they're away for 3 months or 2 months or a month, and then they come back and they record 4 sounds or something. But the thing is not always like just like the actual sound, it's also like just listening when you're shooting. And I think that's the important part of kind of at least starting up your process of thinking about sound and being okay with people being quiet and being okay with people like just listening. It's a very like great way of starting up a collaboration where sound is just as important as visuals.
I'm just wondering, when you're sitting and doing all the sound effects and stuff, do you do it in a certain order? Like, do you always start with the sound that's already existing or the sound of the room, and then or do you just?
I spend a lot of time on collecting sounds, so getting sounds from these different environments where things are happening. I mean, if I can go there myself and record, it's amazing. I mean, if it's in Ukraine, I can't just go there, so I get hold of someone who... So I get like a library of sounds that I can use. And then, as I said earlier, like the first thing I do is starting out on some key scenes, so that you kind of find a way together with the director of, okay, how should this sound? Because then you can kind of bring that to the rest of the film. So, I mean, for a film like Distant Barking of Dogs, there were like these war scenes, there were some of these very intimate scenes inside the house. There were these flashes from the war, like the one we just saw with the voiceover. I mean, these are different parts of the film that has a different character to them. So to find out, okay, how should these sound? then when you've kind of agree on that, then you can do the other sequences that have the same kind of language, because you've found a way together that you think works well with this kind of scene. And that doesn't mean that things doesn't need to be refined and so on, but just kind of finding a language together is very important.
Two questions. The recorders that you recommend, would Zoom be one of them?
Yeah, for example, yeah.
Okay. And the other, how many hours do you put into film like this?
I think I don't really work that many more hours than, I usually say that for every 15 minutes of film, I would like to have 1 week of sound editing. So if a film is like 1.5 hour long, then it's 6 weeks, and then I think we mixed this film for a week. So that's on top of that. And then we had 1 day of Foley or something. And what I then do is that one of those weeks, or maybe 1.5 of those weeks, I spread out during like all of the picture editing and sometimes all of the shoot. So in the end, I only have like maybe 5 weeks or 4.5 weeks. But then I spent that time kind of finding out, okay, how should this sound? How should this movie sound? And it means that when I actually get to the actual sound editing, then I already know how it should sound, and I get much more kind of precise. Because often, if I just get a film and then then you do the sound, then it takes a couple of weeks for you to kind of figure out, okay, how should this sound? But the thing is, by working this way, that I already know how it should sound. I just have to do it in a way. And it really, really helps the process in that way. So I don't feel like I'm really, this schedule that I've always been working by for the last many years, it's not like I'm working much more than that. It's just spread out for a long, long time. So sometimes I start working on something I'm gonna do sound for a year after, or a year and a half after. So, yeah. The process is different, but the result is better. Thank you for listening.
Indtil vi er færdige med at tale. Er der noget, der mangler?
How are you? Good? Good. Just arrived. I'm just trying to find my feet. Yeah, he's here, baby. You know each other, yeah?
I think we have.
So just checking out what everything looks like, right? So you stay right for the board as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have time? No, not this year.
No, we are.
Hvis man er plus over, er plus over.
Yeah, these dead ends with financing, I understand.
Sådan en plus år. Der er jo ikke nogen, der har en minus år.